October 14th, 1943, 25,000 feet above Germany. The air was filled with fire. The sky over Schweinfurt looked like the mouth of a furnace, smoke boiling upward from burning bombers, tracer rounds streaking red across a pale autumn sun. In formation, 291 flying fortresses crawled eastward, heavy with bombs, their engines straining as waves of German fighters tore through them. From the ground, it must have looked like an armada of steel birds. From inside, it felt more like a slaughterhouse suspended in the clouds. Gunfire echoed through aluminum hulls as oxygen masks hissed, and crews screamed into radios that had long since gone silent. By the time the day was over, 60 of those B-17s would never come home. 600 airmen would vanish into smoke, fire, or enemy fields below. Those who survived called it Black Thursday, the day the flying fortress stopped living up to its name. In the tail of one of those bombers crouched a 22-year-old gunner named Jack Donovan, a Detroit factory kid who had traded machine grease for gun oil, rivets for bullets. The Army Air Forces had told him the B-17 was invincible, that its armor and firepower made it a fortress in the sky. But as he gripped the handles of his twin .50 caliber Brownings, watching tracers flash by, he knew the truth. A fortress only mattered if its walls could shoot back. The tail was supposed to be the most secure position on the plane, but it was also the most hunted. German Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s loved the approach from 6 o'clock low, a blind spot where sunlight and exhaust fumes made them nearly invisible until it was too late. Jack's job was to stop them, but the odds were cruel. The B-17's tail guns used the same ring and bead sight that dated back to World War I. 2 bits of metal the size of a thumb, useless against an enemy closing at 500 miles per hour. The Army called it training. The gunners called it guessing. At best, only 1 in 12 bursts ever struck a target. The official hit rate sat around 6 to 8%, and even that was generous. Most gunners died before they ever improved. Jack knew those numbers. He'd read them in briefings and seen them in empty bunks back at Bassingbourn. Every day, bombers took off in neat rows and returned like broken teeth, gaps where friends used to be. He'd only flown 6 missions, but already he had learned the sound of a dying engine, the way metal screamed before it tore apart. What scared him most wasn't dying. It was dying without ever landing a hit. He was a mechanic by trade, a hands-on thinker who fixed things that didn't work. The tailgun, he realized, wasn't working. Not the mount, not the ammunition, not even the concept. It was built for a slower war, a simpler enemy. Now, facing the precision of the Luftwaffe, it was a relic. He squeezed the triggers again, watching another streak of tracers arc harmlessly behind an enemy fighter. It didn't even flinch. The FW-190's cannons spat back, shredding the B-17's wing to ribbons. The aircraft shook, alarms howling through the intercom, and Jack's breath fogged his oxygen mask as he tried to line up another shot. He wasn't scared anymore. He was furious. Furious at the engineers who'd designed a gun sight that let his friends die with full ammo belts. Furious at the silence on the radio as one bomber after another fell away. Furious at himself for missing. By noon, the mission was over. The surviving bombers limped back across the channel, engines smoking, crews too drained to speak. When Jack stepped off the hardstand at Bassingbourn, the ground tilted beneath his boots, as if gravity itself had forgotten how to hold him. He walked past rows of empty dispersal bays, the spaces where planes had once been parked, now just oil stains and spent shell casings. In the mess hall, someone muttered the numbers. 60 bombers lost, 600 gone, and the room fell silent. Later that night, Jack sat alone in the tail of his own battered B-17, flashlight trembling in his hand, staring through the spiderweb cracks in the plexiglass window. The cold seeped through his gloves, biting at his skin. but he didn't move. Out there, beyond the glass, he could still see the black smoke of the day's battle drifting over Europe, lit by the faint glow of burning fuel. He leaned closer, his breath fogging the surface, and that's when he noticed it. The fractured glass caught the light just right, bending it into a reflection. For a moment, he saw not just his face but the sky behind him, angles of space the ring sight could never show. It was nothing, just a trick of light, yet it stuck in his mind like a riddle waiting to be solved. His bullets had always missed, but what he saw in that cracked piece of glass that night would soon rewrite the manual of air combat. The base had gone quiet after the debriefs. Engines were silent, hangars half lit by maintenance lamps, and the air still carried the metallic scent of oil and cordite. Jack Donovan sat alone in the tail section of his bomber, the same shattered window before him, the cold pressing in through the thin fuselage. He traced the cracks with his eyes, watching how they split and curved like lightning frozen in glass. Each fracture caught light from his flashlight and threw it into strange angles across the metal frames. In that fractured glow, something clicked. He realized that what the light did to his reflection, bending it, redirecting it, was exactly what he needed his gun sights to do to his view of the enemy. The idea was absurd at first. No training manual, no officer, no engineer had ever mentioned using reflections to aim a weapon. But Jack wasn't trained to invent. He was trained to survive. And in that cockpit silence, he began to think not like a soldier, but like a mechanic again. Back home in Detroit, when an engine block refused to line up, you didn't rebuild the whole car. You found a workaround. Maybe war wasn't so different. He remembered his time in the auto shop, adjusting mirrors on trucks to see around blind corners, using nothing more than instinct and reflection to guide precision movements. The thought seemed ridiculous in the middle of a bomber's tale, yet the logic held. If a mirror could show what the human eye missed, could it also show where bullets were going? He imagined it. A set of small, angled mirrors fixed along the inside of his canopy, each one reflecting the path of his tracers as they left the barrels. If he could see the stream of fire without twisting his neck or guessing through fogged glass, he could correct in real time. And if a piece of reflective glass could be mounted near his gun sight to overlay a target marker, he wouldn't have to guess where to lead a fighter diving at 400 miles per hour. He didn't need a computer. He needed a reflection. The next day, while other crews grabbed a few hours of rest before the next mission, Jack scavenged the wrecks of damaged aircraft parked at the edge of the field. The maintenance crews called it the graveyard, a line of half-burned bombers waiting to be stripped for parts. Among the twisted metal, he found a shattered navigation mirror from a downed B-24 and a cracked reflector plate from a crashed P-47 fighter. He tucked them into his flight bag, heart pounding, half expecting an officer to shout after him. That night, he spread his finds across a mess table like a gambler laying out cards. The fragments glinted under a single lamp as he began sketching in his logbook. 3 mirrors, angled at different degrees, one to catch the direct view down, the gun barrel, one to show the tracer arc, and one to merge both reflections into a single line of sight. He wasn't sure it would work, but the geometry made sense. He measured angles with the edge of a ration tin, calculated spacing with a pencil stub, and noted how light struck each surface. Hours passed unnoticed. Outside, the English rain began to fall against the hangar roof, and somewhere distant, a generator coughed itself awake. To anyone walking by, he looked like a man repairing equipment. In truth, he was rewriting how tail gunners would fight. The only problem was that the Air Force didn't permit unauthorized modifications. Every aircraft part, every sight, every bolt was inspected, approved, and stamped by the Army Air Force's Materiel Command. Changing even a bracket without paperwork was a punishable offense. But Jack wasn't trying to impress a review board. He was trying to keep his crew alive. He could still hear his pilot's voice over the intercom that morning. "Tails hit. I'm losing power." He could still feel the vibration as cannon shells tore through the fuselage just feet from where he knelt. If mirrors could give him even a fraction of a second's advantage, wasn't that worth the risk? He thought of the men who never came back from Schweinfurt, the bombers that went down burning, the families who would soon receive telegrams instead of letters. Regulation didn't stop the bullets. Something else had to. When dawn came, the first gray light revealed a man changed. His eyes were rimmed with fatigue but alive with a quiet determination. He tucked the sketchbook inside his flight jacket, the drawings of what he called the triple mirror sight. To test it properly, he'd need help, someone who knew tools, someone who could weld and wouldn't ask too many questions. He knew just the man, Tech Sergeant Frank Miller, an older mechanic with hands like iron and a reputation for fixing what no one else could. Jack found him near the hangar, repairing a landing gear strut. Without a word, he pulled out the sketches and set them down on the workbench. Miller studied them, his grease-stained thumb following the lines. "You trying to build a periscope or a death wish?" he asked dryly. Jack grinned, exhausted but unwavering. "Maybe both," he said. Miller didn't laugh. Instead, he leaned closer. "You know they'll throw you in the stockade if you mess with government hardware." Jack's answer was quiet. "They can't court-martial a corpse, Frank. I'm tired of watching friends die because we can't hit what's right in front of us." For a long moment, Miller said nothing. Then he slid the sketches back across the table. "Meet me here after lights out," he said. "Bring your glass." That was all Jack needed to hear. As the base settled into silence that night, two figures moved through the shadows of the hangar, carrying toolboxes and contraband mirrors toward the tail of a Ploiești, battle-scarred B-17. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the air crisp and electric, as if the sky itself were holding its breath. Inside, under a single lamp, sparks would soon fly. Tomorrow, their creation would either save lives or end both of their careers. But for Jack Donovan, the choice had already been made. He wasn't breaking orders yet. He was just breaking the limits of what a gunner could see. And by morning, those limits would be tested in the most dangerous way imaginable. Would the insane mirror trick work when the next wave of fighters came screaming in? The night at Bassingbourn was cold and silent, a windless expanse of dark fields and idle runways glimmering under scattered floodlights. In the far corner of Hangar 12, two figures moved like ghosts. Donovan and Tech Sergeant Frank Miller carried their toolboxes as if they were contraband, the clinking metal echoing off steel walls. The rest of the base slept, unaware that one of its bombers was about to be transformed in secret. The tail of the B-17 Liberty Bell loomed before them, still blackened from flak hits. The smell of oil and burned paint hung thick in the air. Miller set down the lamp, its weak light revealing his tired eyes and cigarette-stained fingers. "You really think this'll work?" he asked quietly, already knowing the answer. Donovan unwrapped the salvaged pieces of glass, setting them beside a dented sight mount. "If it doesn't, I won't be around long enough to care," he said, his voice steady. For the next 6 hours, the two men worked without rest. They shaped aluminum brackets from scrap, bent mounting arms over an oil drum, and welded tiny joints with sparks that flickered like fireflies in the gloom. The first mirror went up at a 30-degree angle, catching the reflection of the twin gun barrels. The second sat just above the ring sight, showing the stream of tracers as they'd leave the barrels. The third, a small fragment from a P-47 reflector plate, was placed so it aligned the reticle directly over the target's path. It was crude, it was improvised, and it broke half a dozen regulations before sunrise. Miller leaned back, wiping sweat from his face with a rag blackened by soot. "You know," he muttered, "if the paperwork doesn't kill us, The Germans will. Donovan smiled faintly. Then we'll make it count. They tested the mechanism by hand, Miller standing outside the turret while Donovan adjusted the mirrors from inside. Up 5 degrees, Miller said, his voice echoing through the metal frame. Now left. Hold it. You seeing what I'm seeing? Donovan's voice came back, muffled by the fuselage. For the first time, yeah. I can see my own tracers before I even pull the trigger. The realization hit both men at once. What they'd built wasn't just an aiming aid. It was a feedback system, a way for a gunner to watch the path of his bullets and adjust instantly. In that moment, the two understood they had crossed a line, not out of rebellion, but necessity. As the first light crept through the hangar's slats, the bomber's tail gleamed like the eye of a creature waking from sleep. Miller doused the torch and exhaled. There, he said softly. Mirror sight, Mark 1. Donovan stepped out of the turret, stretching his aching back. He looked at the contraption with a mixture of pride and dread. It was the ugliest thing he'd ever seen. Crooked bolts, uneven welds, streaks of scorched paint. But it might just save lives. He ran a hand along the metal as if committing it to memory. They covered the site with a maintenance tarp and packed away the tools before dawn inspection. Neither man spoke as they walked out of the hangar. Some risks didn't need words. Later that day, as the squadron assembled for mission briefing, Donovan's crew was assigned to another daylight bombing run, this time over Münster. The room buzzed with tension. No one had forgotten Schweinfurt. The intelligence officer pointed to maps and flak zones, his voice flat from exhaustion. But Donovan's mind wasn't on the route. It was on the mirrors hidden under that tarp, waiting. When the meeting ended, Miller caught his eye from across the hangar. A small nod passed between them. The test would happen today. As mechanics fueled the bombers and crews strapped on parachutes, Donovan slipped back into the tail section, locking the hatch behind him. The makeshift sight sat gleaming under the low morning light, still untested. He adjusted the first mirror until it reflected both barrels evenly, then aligned the reticle plate. His heart pounded with anticipation and fear. If the system failed, no one would ever know. If it worked, maybe, just maybe, it would change everything. When the engines roared to life, the vibrations rattled the glass, but didn't shatter it. A good sign. Donovan secured his oxygen line, checked his guns, and reported ready. As the bomber taxied toward the runway, he could see Miller outside, arms crossed, pretending to inspect another aircraft. The older man gave a single thumbs up before stepping back. The wheels lifted off, and the ground fell away. Inside the tail, Donovan stared at his reflection in the small mirror. The same eyes he'd seen in the cracked plexiglass a night ago stared back, tired, determined, and maybe a little insane. The crew's intercom crackled with static. "Tail, how's it look back there?" the pilot asked. Donovan smiled behind his mask. "Clear skies," he said. "For now." At 20,000 feet, they leveled out, joining formation. The air grew thin and bright, the kind of cold that bit through gloves and turned breath to mist. Below them, Germany stretched in shades of gray and green. Ahead lay the city, and somewhere out there, the hunters of the Luftwaffe were waiting. Donovan ran one last check on the mount, tightening the bolts with a wrench from his pocket. Everything held. He felt a strange calm, like the moment before a storm hits. He thought of the hundreds of gunners across England flying with outdated sights, their odds measured in percentages too low to matter. This wasn't about defiance anymore. It was about giving those men a chance. The mission over Münster would be long and brutal, but it would also be the proving ground. The mirror sight Mark 1 was ready, and so was he. He flexed his fingers on the triggers, the engine's deep vibrations steady through the floor. Ahead of him, the horizon shimmered with faint contrails. They were not alone in the sky. Somewhere in that blinding blue distance, the next test waited, fast, armed, and lethal. The question wasn't whether his invention would work. The question was whether it would work before a German fighter found his range. Would the crude mirrors built in secrecy turn a blind spot into a weapon? Or would this outlaw idea die with its first shot? The roar of engines filled the sky as the formation approached the German border, a forest of contrails stretching behind them. The horizon shimmered with cold sunlight, and the rhythmic pulse of propellers echoed through Jack Donovan's bones. Inside the tail turret, everything was noise and vibration. He adjusted the oxygen mask, checked his ammo feeds, and stared into the mirrors gleaming faintly against the steel. The bomber's radio crackled with the calm voices of men who had learned not to sound afraid. "Bandits inbound, 11 o'clock high, count multiple groups." His stomach clenched. He couldn't see them yet, but he could feel them out there, circling like sharks. The pilot's voice came next, firm but steady. "Stay sharp, boys. They'll come in from below. Tail, call them early." Donovan replied, "Roger that." His gloves tightened on the triggers. A few seconds later, the first dark specks appeared on the horizon. German F-190s, their wings flashing in the sunlight, diving through the formation like blades through glass. The radio erupted with warnings and curses as bombers ahead began to take hits. He tracked one fighter breaking off from the pack, dropping low, lining up for the classic 6 o'clock approach, the angle that always spelled death for the man in the tail. But this time, Jack wasn't guessing. He leaned into the mirror system, aligning the glowing reticle reflected in front of his eyes. Through one mirror, he could see his barrels. Through another, the tracers from his first short burst cutting across the sky. The reflection told him exactly where he was missing. Too far behind. He adjusted by inches and fired again. The tracers converged. For the first time, he saw the rounds connect, the bright sparks flaring against the fighter's cowling. The Focke-Wulf shuddered, its propeller wobbling, then spiraled downward, trailing a ribbon of black smoke. Donovan froze, unable to believe it. His crew's intercom crackled with disbelief. "Tail gunner got one! Confirmed hit!" The pilot laughed, a sound of sheer relief breaking through the static. "Hell of a shot, Donovan." But there was no time to celebrate. Another fighter swept in from low right, cannons flashing. Shrapnel tore through the tail's outer skin, metal fragments stinging his neck. He ignored the pain and swung the turret, using the mirrors to pick up the enemy's shadow before it entered the blind zone. He fired a controlled burst. The tracers danced, guided by their own reflection. The German pilot peeled off, smoking. 2 kills in under a minute. Adrenaline surged through him, but beneath it was something else, a realization that the impossible had just happened. The bomber shuddered violently, a reminder that victory was fragile. Anti-aircraft bursts bloomed in the distance like black flowers. Donovan kept scanning, his breath shallow. The mirrors vibrated but held steady, each one now streaked with powder residue. It wasn't perfect. Nothing in war ever was. But it worked. Every adjustment came faster, more instinctive, as if his eyes had finally learned a new language. The formation turned toward the target, bombs ready. But Donovan's heart was still racing from what had just unfolded. By the time they crossed back into the English Channel hours later, silence filled the intercom. The crew was too tired to speak. When they landed, the ground crew rushed in as always, counting bullet holes, patching leaks, checking the engines. Donovan climbed out of the turret, his body stiff, his mind somewhere between disbelief and awe. Waiting for him on the tarmac was Captain Harland, the squadron armament officer. clipboard in hand, expression unreadable. "Sergeant Donovan," he said, his voice sharp. "Care to explain the equipment installed in your gun position?" Jack hesitated, then answered simply, "It's a sighting improvement, sir. A prototype." The captain's tone hardened. "You installed unauthorized hardware on a combat aircraft?" "Yes, sir," Donovan replied. "And it worked." That last sentence hung in the air like a challenge. Harlan's eyes narrowed. "You've violated multiple regulations. You'll have that removed before the next mission, or I'll have you grounded." Miller, who had been waiting nearby, stepped forward. "Sir, with respect, that sight saved this aircraft. I saw the gun camera footage myself." Harlan cut him off. "You'll both face review for this." He turned on his heel, heading toward the operations office, the clipboard clutched like a weapon. Around them, other airmen had begun to gather, whispering, curious. Word was already spreading. A tail gunner had shot down 2 fighters with a homemade device. Some called it luck, others heresy. But a few, especially the gunners, called it hope. That night, while the base buzzed with rumors, Donovan sat outside the hangar beside Miller. The older man lit a cigarette and handed it over. "Well, kid," he said quietly, "looks like you just made yourself famous. Or finished." Donovan exhaled smoke into the cold night air. "Doesn't matter," he said. "It worked." In the command office across the field, lights burned late. Officers argued over the report, weighing innovation against insubordination. For some, it was a simple matter of discipline. For others, the footage spoke for itself. Somewhere in the heated debate, a new voice cut through the noise, a senior officer known for his bluntness, a man who had watched 17 bombers from his group fall the week before. His name was Colonel Grant. He studied the gun camera stills in silence, the tracers converging perfectly on the enemy fighter's fuselage. Then he looked up. "Who built this?" he asked. "Sergeant Jack Donovan, sir," came the reply. Grant leaned back, his expression unreadable. "Then I want him flying with that system again. 3 missions, cameras rolling. If the numbers check out, we're not taking it off. We're putting it on every fortress we have." The room went silent. Regulations could wait. Survival could not. Outside, unaware of the decision being made, Donovan stared up at the distant stars above the airfield. They reminded him of the tracers, streaks of light vanishing into darkness. Tomorrow, he would fly again, not just to fight, but to prove that his mirrors weren't madness. They were the future. Still, one thought nagged him as he closed his eyes against the cold. Would Colonel Grant's faith hold once the Air Force saw what he had done? Or would the insane mirror trick be buried before it could save anyone else? The next morning broke pale and windless, the English countryside hidden under a thin veil of fog. Inside the operations hut, men whispered over maps while coffee steamed in tin mugs. Donovan stood in the back, his name freshly added to the mission roster. Across the room, Colonel Grant's gravel-thick voice cut through the chatter. 3 runs. Camera rolling. I want proof, not miracles." His tone left no room for doubt. What had started as an act of rebellion was now an experiment sanctioned by command. If Donovan succeeded, it would be a quiet revolution. If he failed, it would die with him. By mid-morning, the bombers were airborne again, another raid deep into Germany. The engines droned in perfect rhythm, a sound both comforting and haunting. In the tail of his plane, Donovan's hands rested steady on the twin 50s, the mirrors polished and realigned. The frost along the edges caught the morning light, turning his improvised device into something almost deliberate, as if it belonged there all along. He whispered to himself, "Let's see if they still call it crazy after this." The first attack came faster than expected. German fighters burst from a bank of clouds, sunlight flashing off their wings as they dove through the formation. Donovan swung the turret, breath shallow, watching the reflections align. In the left mirror he caught the shimmer of tracers. In the right, the faint outline of a Messerschmitt slicing upward. He led by instinct, fired, corrected, and fired again. The gun camera above him clicked steadily, capturing every burst. The fighter exploded mid-climb, its smoke tumbling across the sky like spilled ink. The next few seconds felt unreal, methodical, detached. Each adjustment, each mirrored correction, drew another line of fire that found its mark. When the squadron finally broke through the last wave of attackers, the intercom erupted in disbelief. "Tails got another one! Maybe two!" The navigator's voice cracked with something between joy and shock. Even the pilot sounded stunned. "We're still in formation, and the tail's clean." "What the hell did you build back there, Jack?" Donovan didn't answer. He just watched the enemy trails fade behind them, his reflection trembling faintly in the glass. When they landed hours later, the airfield was already swarming. Officers surrounded the aircraft before its engines stopped turning. Mechanics rolled up ladders, photographers unloaded the gun camera reels, and Colonel Grant himself climbed into the tail, crouching to inspect the Simon sight. He studied it in silence while technicians whispered around him. Then he said simply, "Get those films developed." That evening, the footage was projected in a darkened briefing room. The flickering images showed two German fighters diving, the tracers bending toward them like guided arrows, then bursting into flames. The room was silent until Grant finally spoke. "Gentlemen, we just tripled our odds of survival." The decision came swift and absolute. Production of the mirror system would begin immediately. Within days, the hangar that once hid their secret became an improvised workshop. Under Miller's supervision, crews scavenged parts from damaged aircraft, cutting reflector plates and bending scrap aluminum into new mounts. 4 mirror assemblies a day, then 6, then 8. Donovan helped where he could, adjusting angles, sketching improvements between missions. The once illegal invention now carried an official name, Mirror Sight Type 1. The rumor spread faster than the orders. Across the 91st Bomb Group, gunners began begging mechanics for the new setup, calling them Donovan mirrors. Even the skeptics changed their tune when kill rates doubled. By late November, 200 bombers were flying with the system installed. Combat reports told the story better than any briefing could. Tailgun accuracy climbed to more than 20%. Enemy pilots began avoiding rear attacks altogether, switching to head-on runs that cost them more lives than they could replace. In the diaries of captured German flyers, Allied intelligence found a phrase repeated again and again. "The fortresses are no longer blind." Colonel Grant forwarded one report to higher command with a single handwritten note. "Innovation born of necessity. Recommend full adoption." The official paperwork crawled through channels, but the war moved faster. In practice, the mirror systems spread beyond their control. Crews copied the design, making crude replicas from shaving mirrors, periscopes, even pieces of broken canopy glass. For the first time in months, airmen climbed into their planes with a sliver of confidence. They joked about Donovan's angles and Detroit optics, small phrases that masked the deeper truth. They were living longer because one man refused to obey. Not everyone celebrated. In headquarters meetings, senior officers debated the ethics of field modifications. Some warned that uncontrolled innovation invited disaster, that discipline was the backbone of an army. Grant listened to them all, then spoke quietly. "Discipline keeps men in line. Ingenuity keeps them alive." The line hung in the air long after the meeting ended. By winter, results spoke louder than any argument. Luftwaffe reports showed their fighter losses climbing. Attacks from the rear fell by a third. Tail gunners were now claiming kills once reserved for turret crews. The mirror trick had changed the geometry of the war. It was no longer a desperate scramble at the back of the bomber. It was a duel the Germans could no longer win. Donovan flew his required missions one by one, accumulating more kills but keeping to himself. He didn't boast, didn't write home about it, didn't even sit for the official photographs. For him, each mission was simply proof that the idea worked, that sometimes breaking the rules was the only way to keep others from breaking apart in the sky. When the year turned and the cold deepened, Grant's faith was vindicated. Higher command approved full standardization. Factories back home began incorporating the mirror sight into upgraded B-17G models. Boeing engineers credited the system as a field-proven improvement to visual targeting. None of them mentioned who had built it or how. Donovan didn't mind. Recognition wasn't the point. Every safe landing, every empty bunk that stayed filled, was the only credit he needed. Still, he couldn't help but wonder how long it would last. Innovation in war was always temporary, swallowed by the next crisis. As 1943 gave way to 1944, the air war shifted. The Allies gained strength, the enemy faltered, but the sky remained merciless. Donovan kept flying, his mirrors worn and streaked with grime but still catching the light. Each reflection reminded him of the night he first saw his own face in a cracked window, the moment that changed everything. He had no way of knowing that future generations of engineers would study the same principles, refining them into precision fire control systems for the next era of bombers. All he knew was that the tail guns finally worked, that the blind spot had been conquered by a mechanic's stubbornness and a handful of salvaged glass. Yet history, like the sky, had its own turbulence. Command was shifting again. New officers, new doctrines, new technology. And though the mirror sight had saved countless lives, its origin story was already being erased from the records. Donovan's name rarely appeared in the official memos. To the bureaucracy, it was a collective innovation, a field adaptation born of teamwork. But to the men who flew with it, there was no question who had changed their fate. They called it Donovan's reflection, a quiet acknowledgement passed from crew to crew. The war was turning, victory inching closer, but the question remained. When the guns finally fell silent, would anyone remember the outlaw who gave them back their eyes? Or would the insane mirror trick vanish into the machinery of history, its reflection fading like smoke against the endless sky? By the spring of 1945, the skies over Europe looked different. The roar of the Luftwaffe had softened to a growl. German airfields lay in ruins, their hangars burned out, their fuel gone. Yet the bombers kept flying, each one carrying pieces of Jack Donovan's improvised idea inside their tails, no longer hidden, no longer forbidden. The mirrors had changed form now, refined by engineers, standardized, mass-produced. They were no longer scavenged from wrecks or welded by flashlight. They were polished, precise, stamped with serial numbers. The Air Force called them an advancement in optics. Donovan called them a reminder. Every time he adjusted the reticle on his gun, he thought of the night in that empty hangar when it all began, and of the men who didn't live long enough to see it work. He had stopped counting missions after 25. His hair had begun to gray around the edges, though he was barely 23. The war had a way of doing that. When the surrender came, it wasn't with fireworks or songs, just silence, a kind of stunned quiet that stretched across every airfield. Donovan was in France when the news reached his crew. The engines of their bomber idled as the pilot stepped down from the cockpit and said, almost awkwardly, "It's over, boys." The relief was strange. There was no victory shout, no cheer, only men sitting on their gear in the grass, staring into the distance as if trying to remember what life had been before the sky became a battlefield. For the first time in years, Donovan took off his flight gloves and let the air touch his hands. The mirror sight still hung in its frame above the guns, streaked with oil and smoke. He looked into it one last time and saw his reflection. Older, thinner, a stranger with eyes that had seen too much light and too much dark. He wondered if anyone beyond this field would ever understand what those mirrors had really done. They hadn't just helped men aim. They'd helped them survive the impossible, to see in a place where sight itself had failed. After the war, Jack returned home to Detroit. The factory whistles still blew, but the world felt smaller. The noise of stamping presses reminded him of engines, and sparks from the furnaces looked too much like tracer fire. He took a job at a small garage, fixing carburetors and transmissions, hands blackened again with oil instead of cordite. Neighbors knew him only as the quiet mechanic with the limp and the far-off stare. He rarely spoke of the war. If someone asked, he'd shrug and say he worked on planes, leaving out that those planes had been his prison, his classroom, and his invention all at once. The only clue sat on a shelf in his workshop, a small wooden box, its hinges rusted, its contents unknown. Inside lay 3 mirrors, cracked and tarnished, wrapped in a piece of his old flight jacket. He never showed them to anyone. He didn't need to. 4 decades later, in 1983, an invitation arrived in the mail. The envelope bore the seal of the 91st Bomb Group Association. They were holding a reunion at Bassingbourn, the same airfield where it had all begun. Donovan almost didn't go. But something in him, some unfinished echo of that life, said he should. When he arrived, the base was barely recognizable. The runways were overgrown, the hangars turned to museums. Yet in the faces of the old men who greeted him, men with canes and medals and laughter that hid the weight of memory, he saw fragments of those he'd flown with. During the evening reception, one of them approached, stooped but smiling, holding a small metal bracket in his hand. "Jack," the man said, voice trembling, "I've kept this for 40 years. It's from your site. Because of you, I made it home." The old gunner's eyes glistened. "My kids exist because you couldn't accept lousy sites." Donovan didn't know what to say. He laughed softly, embarrassed. "You would have done the same thing," he replied. But the man shook his head. "No, Jack. Only you thought to put a mirror between us and death." They stood there in silence, 2 men bound by something invisible, the weight of all those they'd left behind pressing gently between them. Later that night, as the crowd thinned and the lights dimmed, Donovan walked back to the airfield alone. The hangar doors were locked, but he could still see the outline of the space where he and Miller had once worked by lamplight. Miller was gone now too, buried somewhere back in Michigan. Donovan smiled faintly, imagining his old friend leaning over the workbench again, grumbling about paperwork. He whispered into the empty night, "We did all right, Frank." In the years that followed, historians would trace the lineage of the mirror site through military archives. They'd find it folded into the design of the Cheyenne tail turret, refined again in the B-29's advanced fire control system, and echoed decades later in the computerized sensors of the B-52. Each new layer of technology carried the same idea at its core. A gunner should see what his bullets are doing in real time. Engineers would call it feedback targeting. Jack Donovan would have called it common sense. The Air Force never issued an award for it. No medal, no public recognition. To the bureaucracy, it was just another technical improvement. But to those who had flown the old fortresses, the truth lived on quietly, passed around like a story that refused to die. In his final years, Jack rarely spoke of the war. When reporters or historians came asking, he waved them away. "It's not my story," he'd say. it's theirs. He lived long enough to see men walk on the moon, to watch the skies he once fought through become peaceful highways for jets. He died in 2003 at 79, a widower, survived by 2 children who never knew the full weight of what their father had done. In his obituary, tucked in the local newspaper between weather and classifieds, one line mentioned his military service. World War II veteran, 8th Air Force. Nothing more. But his reflection didn't vanish. Somewhere in a museum display case labeled simply Improvised Tailgun Sight, 1943, light still catches the surface of a small, bent mirror. Visitors walk past it without knowing the name behind it, unaware that it once saved men they would never meet. And if you look closely, in that faint reflection, you can still see the ghost of a young gunner from Detroit, staring back through time, steady, unflinching, seeing the world as it truly is, fragile, brilliant, and worth breaking a few rules to protect. Would he have done it again, knowing how quietly history would forget? Maybe that was never the point. Maybe the real legacy of Jack Donovan wasn't in recognition, but in every life that never became a telegram home. Sometimes the loudest victories are fought in silence, and sometimes the clearest vision of all comes from a cracked piece of glass left behind in the shadows of a hangar.